Good to have everyone with us. Before we get into our study, let's begin with a word of prayer. Our most gracious Heavenly Father, we bow before you now with humble and grateful hearts for the opportunity that you've blessed us with, the ability to be together in this place tonight, to have this building to assemble, to have above that, to have your truth before us that we can understand the revelation through these prophets for our lives. Father, I pray that as we seek the truth, we see the immediate application to whom it was written, the context in which it was written, and then how that same context would then apply to our lives today and our current situations. Father, we're so grateful that you've given us this text to understand your truth, and I pray, Father, that you've got our hearts and our minds throughout this time of study, that we set our hearts upon that truth and only that truth. Forgive us when we fall short of your glory. It's in your Son's precious name we pray. Amen. All right, in our Minor Prophet study tonight, we come to the book of Habakkuk. This is another one I'm going to give you a couple minutes to find, just to make sure everybody knows where it is, how to get to it. It's a short little book near the end of the Old Testament. It's number 8 in our list of what we've gone through so far in the Minor Prophets. And it's one that, to be honest with you, is easy to flip right past. I was telling Tony before we ever began the service tonight that even when I studied the Minor Prophets going through school, that we combined a couple of them basically into one lesson. And Habakkuk, Zephaniah, and they were all just kind of crammed into one. You flew right through it. It didn't get a lot of attention. And so as I've spent a few days now really diving deeper into Habakkuk, I've come to appreciate it. In fact, I told Tony, it's very likely that Habakkuk has now become my favorite of the prophets so far, based on his writing and his relevance. Because, I mean, it speaks directly to us. We should all be able to relate to what we're going to read tonight, and you'll see why here in just a moment. Now, there are some commonalities in the book of Habakkuk, really that rings true to what we've studied in every book so far, that essentially we know nothing about the prophet. We're not given much information at all. We know his name is Habakkuk. That means embrace, and Miss Sonia was quick to try to correct me, saying my pronunciation was incorrect of Habakkuk, which really, if you're going to say it by the Hebrew, that B is really a V, it's Habakkuk. If you're really going to say it according to the Hebrew, Miss Sonia, but you know, we're not in the correcting business around here. Well, actually, I guess that's exactly what we're in the business of. But other than that, essentially nothing is known of the prophet Habakkuk. The Bible does not mention him anywhere else outside of this writing. Mention him. Now, he's quoted three separate times, I don't say all, but the Apostle Paul, in Romans, Galatians, and then the Hebrews writer. So twice by Paul, and then the Hebrews writer makes mention of him as well. We talked about this past Sunday. We can't even be sure of the date of the prophecy of Habakkuk because, remember, that they don't just tell us. Wouldn't it be easier when you're studying in the Bible if they just said, hey, this letter was written in 620 BC? It'd be easier, right? Well, they don't do that. They tell you this book, well, kind of like what next week we're going to be, we get to Zephaniah. It says, written in the days of Josiah. We know the time period of Josiah, therefore we know when that book was written. For us, we have to narrow down when this book was written based on events being recorded. So Habakkuk mentions the rise of the Babylonians and before the fall of Judah. So we can narrow down about a 20-year time period. So we're going to say 620 BC is the time frame. Now, Habakkuk, the reason I said I find it so fascinating is so far we've gone through 7 prophets. All right, I'm not going to start calling on you. If I do, I'm going to call on Paul first. And we'll just say, all right, we start with Hosea. Tell me what it was about. We're going to do a refresher. That may be coming. I know that's something that William would like back there in the back. Start calling on people. Michael, tell me what it was. Just start calling on people randomly. Well, what year was Michael written? And if you give me an exact year, I'm going to tell you wrong. But basically, you had all these prophets who were given a vision, given a message, some sort of revelation to give to some group, right? You had some prophets had a message for Israel. Some prophets had a message to Edom, some to Judah, 2 to Nineveh. Now, Paul, if you want bonus points, if you can name the 2 to Nineveh, you get all the bonus points tonight. But I wouldn't put you, don't do okay.
Nahum and Jonah. What's my bonus points?
You don't get them if you're a suck-up, right? Now, so while all the other prophets were written to a group, Habakkuk stands alone. See, Habakkuk isn't a prophet, a prophecy getting written to someone else. This book, what we're going to look at tonight in Habakkuk, is basically a dialogue. I want you to think about Habakkuk like this. It's like we're sitting close by and we're eavesdropping in on a conversation that Habakkuk and God are having with each other. It is literally a dialogue back and forth between God and Habakkuk, and we're just going to be witness to this conversation. Habakkuk asks questions, God answers. God answers, Habakkuk asks more questions. That's all this prophecy is about. So what we find as we get into the book, Habakkuk is struggling quite a bit with everything that's unfolding. And I guess to paraphrase the gist of the question, and you tell me if this sounds familiar. I'm telling you this is one of the most practical of the prophets you're going to read. The gist of his question is, God, why is there so much evil today? That's the gist of his question. Why do you let evil continue to exist? Why don't you do something about it? That's essentially the questions he's going to ask. And he says things like, evil seems to triumph over good. And on the surface, it seems, God, like you're doing nothing about it. Now, I want you to think about that in terms of faith today. Are people not asking the exact same question? Exact same question, right? Why is this happening? God, when are you going to do something about this? And what we end up doing, even without necessarily meaning to, is we start questioning God, just like Habakkuk does here. And so before we even get into the text tonight, I'm going to go ahead and tell you, and I told you why, that he's become one of my favorite for this reason. I'm glad to know that these great men of faith that we look at struggle like I do. He's a prophet, and he's asking the same question. God, what are you doing? Why does evil always seem to win? And why do bad things always seem to happen? And you see, we look at these prophets and we see, it's kind of like the Elijah, when we went through Elijah, right? You only ever look at Elijah as the Mount Carmel version of Elijah, and not when he's done ran off and he's in the cave pouting. We don't look at that side, we look at the highlights. Now here in Habakkuk, we're going to see essentially a low moment building to a high level of faith. We get to see the other side. And to me, that's a great comfort. Maybe it is not to you, but to me it is. To know that, hey, even these great prophets, well, they ask the same questions I do. Now, what this book is going to do for us is going to lay out faith in three separate phases. Right? These phases should sound very familiar to you because they're going to describe where you are right now. You're going to be in one of these three phases. And the first stage that we're going to come to in chapter 1 of Habakkuk is the questioning stage. He begins questioning. That's where he's going to start. Verse 2 is the question. I'm going to back up to verse 1. Well, verse 2 is essentially the question. The burden which the prophet Habakkuk saw, O Lord, and here it is, how long shall I cry, and you will not hear? Even cry out to you violence, and you will not save. So the book begins with Habakkuk. It means he's crying out. He's exaggeratively releasing it out to God. God, like, all this corruption, and what are you going to do about this? Why has nothing happened? And remember where we are in dates, right? We're 620-ish BC. So the prophet is around Judah, and what he's witnessed so far is the deterioration of the nation of Judah. As they're drifting further and further and further into idolatry. We're 620, so how long before we get to the first round of Babylonian, the first time Babylon comes in?
That's 606.
606. So you're 620, they're going to come, remember they come in three waves. Because you remember, Nebuchadnezzar did not want to destroy Jerusalem. That wasn't his initial plan. He came in the first time, they beat him, they defeat him, they take, and then they leave. They leave the temple standing, they leave. And of course, Judah, being Judah, they try to overthrow Babylon. They try to fight, well, they come in again. And finally, the third time, they're like, hey, destroy it all. Get everything, take it down. But the prophet here, he's watching Judah drift further into idolatry. At this point, it's some 80-ish years, 100 years maybe, since Israel has been hauled off into captivity by the Assyrians. And we've said this before, you would think that would have opened Judah's eyes. Well, apparently they weren't interested in what the sin of Israel had done. And so they just had this steady deterioration. And if you're not careful, you see the same levels of deterioration in our country. especially in regard to true biblical worship. Just small step further and further away from true biblical worship. But what he's doing here is he's questioning God. God, how long do I have to cry out for you to help me? How long do I have to cry before you're going to hear me? I even cry violence. Now that word is significant. I even cry violence and you don't hear me. That word in Hebrew for violence is the word Hamas. Has everybody heard the word Hamas before? Yeah. That's where it comes from. It means violence. It's literally came from right here. So he said, I'm shouting Hamas, and it's like you don't even hear me. Why do you show me iniquity and cause me to see trouble? For plundering and violence are before me. There's strife and contention arises. Therefore, listen to verse 4. Therefore the law is powerless, and justice never goes forth. For the wicked surround the righteous, therefore perverse judgment proceeds. That statement, that's a wow statement to hear. Hey, listen, here's the prophet. He's crying to God, right? He said, listen, the law. Well, whose law is it? The law, it's powerless. It's not doing anything. If the law's not doing anything, what he's saying is that the effect of right and wrong, the good and evil, sin, it doesn't mean anything to anyone anymore. Like, they don't care. The people are violent. They're not going to listen. I mean, it sounds like a pretty terrible place. He's like, hey, it's sin. Their approach to it is, well, it's just sin, and who really cares? There's no justice. There's only perversion. He says the wicked have their way. They surround the righteousness. It's strife. It's contention. And so you think about it, we're not beginning a prophecy like we have so far with a prophet being emboldened to go deliver a message. Instead, now we're starting this prophecy with a prophet who's brokenhearted by what he sees. It's like, he's like, just look, your law, like the law's useless. I mean, it's what do you? You're not listening to me. I'm crying out. You're not helping me. And why do you, basically, God? Why do you let these things continue to happen? But let's all be honest for just a moment with each other. Does the way God operates, does it ever seem confusing to you? It does to me. All the time. And I know I get that way from time to time because I see something and I take Habakkuk's approach. Like, God, I realize vengeance belongs to you. Hey, perfect example. Like, it's there. Take them. It'd be great. It's just there, right? And it doesn't happen. And I find myself, when I'm not careful, I find myself in the questioning mode of God, and I have to remind myself something very important. The easiest way I can say it is, I'm not God. That's what I have to remind myself of. You remember what God, through the prophet Isaiah, said in Isaiah 55? Popular, most everybody can quote it. For my thoughts are not your thoughts. My ways are not your ways. Just as heaven is higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than yours. And see, I have to stop and remember that. Like, well, I don't understand what's happening. And it means that even though all these things around me that I don't understand and I can't comprehend, well, God's ways are higher than my ways. His understanding is higher than mine. He understands what we can. And so while something doesn't make sense, there's a comfort in that to know that, hey, God's got this under control. And that's essentially how God is about to respond to Habakkuk here, because you're going to get this back and forth. So right now, Habakkuk's questioning God. God's about to answer. When God answers, that's going to be even more discomforting to Habakkuk. He's going to reply back. We're seeing this dialogue. But I want you to notice this. Do you know what you're not going to find in these passages? Not one time does God chastise Habakkuk for asking these questions. Not once. Instead, he reveals to the prophet a great truth. Hey, you don't see this, but I'm very much at work. That sounds like good news to me until you read basically what he says. So here's God's response. Again, we're just sitting eavesdropping on this conversation. All right? Here's God's response to the prophet. Look among the nations and watch. Be utterly astounded, for I will work a work in your days which you would not believe, though it were told you. For indeed, I am raising up the Chaldeans. That right there, we got his attention in a hurry. I'm raising up the Chaldeans, a bitter and hasty nation, which marches through the breadth of the earth to possess dwelling places that are not theirs. Look among the nations and watch, Habakkuk, and yet immediately when you look out, you see nothing. Look out and watch what's about to happen, but we're a whole generation now from Israel's demise, but guess at this point, who's still in charge? God's in charge. That was a poorly posed question. Who's still the power on the earth right now, the powerful nation on the earth right now? Assyria still is. Babylon's on the rise, but it's still Assyria, which means it's nothing different from 100 years ago when Israel was hauled off. So you're saying, look out and watch, and I'm saying, well, for the last 100 years, nothing's been any different. What Habakkuk doesn't know is that there's something out there unforeseen that's coming, and God says it this way, it will utterly astound you. This is a word you're not going to believe, meaning something the people of Judah would not even think was possible. Now, it's very interesting, that phrase, if your Bible doesn't make mention of that phrase, if it doesn't have a footnote there, you might want to jot this down. The Apostle Paul actually quotes this in Acts 13, verse 41. And when he quotes this phrase, this work that you're not going to believe, he's actually making that quote in regards to Gentiles being brought into the church. This unbelievable work, which of course to the Jews, they couldn't believe it, right? To them, it was a foreign concept that Gentiles would be welcomed into worship with Jews. And so there are a couple of revelations here from the prophet. First off, I, God, am raising up the Chaldeans to be my hand of judgment. Now, when you hear Chaldeans, what do we know? Who do we know that to really be? Babylon. He's saying, I'm raising up the Babylonians, and they're going to come in, and they're going to be the next power, and they're going to overthrow judgment. And aren't y'all thankful the Bible got lucky that that's actually what happened? Because the Bible's prophesying this, and it's not going to happen for another 15 years. It's a good thing the Bible got lucky. That's what would be led to think in a book written by men. But they're about to come, and they're going to possess a land that's not theirs. And basically what you have is this just went from bad to worse. Hang on. What do you mean Judah? The crown jewel. What do you mean Judah? Because it's not just Judah. When you say Judah, narrow it down even more. What's really the crown jewel there? Go ahead. Well, no, I'll tell you. What's in Judah? Jerusalem, the temple. So when you say that this land is going to be possessed by somebody, you're talking about the holy place, right? You're talking Jerusalem. Now, Judah's going to be possessed by somebody, and much less the Babylonians. And even God describes them here. They're bitter, they're hasty, but they're coming. And when they come, there's going to be a big difference. So did Assyria ever try to take over Judah? Did they ever try to conquer Judah? They did Israel. Did they ever try Judah? They did. But why? Judah should have been able to withstand Assyria.
No, God prevented him.
God prevented them. Now, you remember how God, and we think, and that I always find humor in this. I make reference to, sir?
So many thousand killed.
185,000. Do you remember about how many angels? One. And so I get a big kick out of it every time somebody starts talking about the Battle of Armageddon and all this. I'm like, really? You know what just one of God's angels could do, right? I mean, So God prevented this. God stopped Assyria from coming into Judah. Only this time God says, I'm the one doing this. Which is odd when you need to read the rest of this, because he's going to keep describing them. So God's going to use them, and you kind of get the sense, okay, well, maybe they're not so bad. No, he says they're terrible. They're dreadful. Their judgment, their dignity proceed from themselves. Their horses, they're swifter than leopards and more fierce than evening wolves. Their charges charge ahead. Their cavalry comes from afar. They fly as the eagle that hastens to eat. Well, this is just a glowing description for a nation, isn't it? You're awful, terrible, dreadful. And when he says that their judgment and dignity proceed from themselves, what it means is their morality doesn't come from God. Their judgment, what they view to be right or wrong, doesn't come from God. It comes from themselves. Judah is being judged as a nation turning from God by a nation that doesn't worship God. And instead, like Judah now, they're driven by their own will. Now, you don't have to be a Bible scholar to see the relevance and the application in this. Let's say that I define a group for you. We'll just play a little game. Let's say that I define Babylon in a way that I want you to see if you can figure out how this might be relevant. Because when you get to the book of Revelation written to the 7 churches of Asia about their struggle, right? But who's the harlot called in that book? Babylon. Now, Babylon's long gone by this point. Now, what's the reference there? It's being referenced to Rome. Rome's the persecutor of the 7 churches. He says, listen, when it comes to the idea, the epitome of evil and power, well, it's Babylon. And so that's why you get that reference there. And so he's describing Babylon. Let's see, if we take a group of people that basically says it this way. They say that morality is whatever I define it to be. Now, that can't be a common problem. Morality is what I say it is. And then I start reading in the book of Judges. Do you remember, most everybody already knows this. You remember how the book of Judges ends? Everyone did what was right in their own eyes. Basically, another way of saying it is you define morality. Well, that's what Babylon does. And he says, they're terrible. God's going to judge them too. But now think about this from Habakkuk's stance. He's hearing this. Hey, listen, you're asking what I'm going to do? Okay. These terrible, horrible, wicked, they're coming. You're going to see Habakkuk's response here in just a minute. But God keeps giving us this glowing response of Babylon. Verse 9, they all come for violence. Their faces are set like the east wind. They gather captives like sand. They scoff at kings, and princes are scorned by them. They deride every stronghold. They heap up earthen mounds, and they seize it. Then his mind changes, and he transgresses. He commits offense, ascribing this power to his God. So basically what you're getting described here is their approach, their attack, it's scorched earth. They blow in, destroy everything, take captive the people, take all their belongings. But verse 11 is kind of what stuck out to me in their mindset. Remember, this is God speaking here when you read verse 11. He says, the Babylonians, they think their gods give them success. That's their mindset. He says, the reality is, I'm doing this against my own people. But understand, these people are just horrible. They're wicked. They're terrible. The next 70 years, you're going to spend in captivity under them. Of course, we know that it'll be the Medo-Persians too, but you're going to be under them. And they're terrible. They're awful. So you think about this. Just a moment ago, Habakkuk was questioning God. God, aren't you going to do something about all the injustice, all the wickedness? The law is useless. The law can't do anything. To which God says, I'm about to do something. You look and watch, and you see what's about to happen. You don't see it yet. These ruthless, barbaric Babylonians, they're coming. And as much as Habakkuk wanted an answer, I somehow get the feeling that's not the one he wanted. This certainly would not be warm, and he's not going to go curl up in his bed tonight and go, oh, this is so great. Babylon's coming. I can sleep just wonderful now. So what Habakkuk does, now he's got more questions. Like, whoa, what do you mean? I just told you I'm bothered by all the evil that I see. You're going to send more evil? Like the whole tone changes. And so now he's questioning God, trying to figure out, God, what are you going to do? Now he's almost arguing with God. God, are you not from everlasting? Oh Lord, my God, my Holy One, we shall not die. Oh Lord, you have appointed them for judgment, O rock. You have marked them for correction. You are pure, you are of purer eyes than to behold evil, and cannot look on wickedness. Why do you look on those who deal treacherously, and hold your tongue when the wicked devours a person more righteous than he? I'm going to paraphrase this a little bit just for time's sake. So he says, God, you're from everlasting. You've always taken care of your people. And since you're from everlasting, your people, they're not going to die. You're going to take care of them like you've always had. They just need a little bit of correction. They need a little bit of discipline. I don't understand what you're saying about Babylon. Why would you do something like that? Why would you use Babylon? Even though it's exactly what he was asking for moments ago. See, we want God to answer, but you always like the answer you get. And tell me that this is not one of the most human answers you hear in the prophet so far. God, why would you send someone so wicked to destroy a people less wicked than they are? That's his question. Basically, I know Judah's bad, but Babylon's worse. There's no way you can look favorably on them. We don't make the conclusion here that God is somehow accepting Babylon's wickedness. He's not. They're going to face their own judgment, but God is going to use them for his purpose. And so you get this, and so again, now Habakkuk, he's going to end chapter 1, and he's really making his statement to God. God, why? So verse 14, and we're not going to read all these, but verse 14, you make men like the fish of the sea, like creeping things that have no ruler over them. They take them up with a hook, they catch them with their net, they gather their dragnet. He's talking about what Babylon's doing to all the people. They're vile, they're wicked, they're doing all these things. And so he's now questioning God after God is answering him about his original questions. Now understand something before we move on, so that this point does not get lost in the book of Habakkuk. There's nothing wrong with asking God questions. Now, I would say it this way. Is asking God questions and questioning God the same thing? See, we ask God questions all the time. Like, God, I don't know why this is happening. Like, what are you going to do about this? Well, when all of a sudden you just start questioning, like, God, you're wrong in this. I mean, you're tiptoeing dangerous lines when you start playing, because now you're full on questioning God. So it's more of asking questions to God versus questioning God. But you notice again that at any point in time, when you read through chapter 1, has God said, hey, Habakkuk, I'm God, don't question me? Did you read that verse? In fact, when God responds, did he even say, oh, you have little faith? He didn't even say that. He just answers the question. And it's actually, there's actually a common theme in the Bible, believe it or not. When you actually start looking at these, you think about the Old Testament, one of the greatest examples of faith, Moses always comes up. You look at Abraham, Moses. Moses questioned God multiple times. God calls Moses, hey, you're going to go be my deliverer. He's like, me? I'm not eloquent of speech. You need to send somebody else. Well, then he finally goes, and he goes before Pharaoh, and he's like, hey, Pharaoh, listen, God sent me, you're going to let the people go. And Pharaoh's like, what? Like, how are you going to kill an Egyptian, run off, and now you're going to tell me what I'm going to do with my slave? I'm not letting him go. He doesn't let him go. And in fact, after he comes the first time, do you remember what Pharaoh does? Do what? He takes the straw away. He makes life harder for the Jews. I'm going to make it even worse. And then they come, and they actually start questioning Moses, like, hey, what are you doing? You're making life worse for us. And then Moses turns again, and he's already seen a power display of God. And then after this, he turns to God and he says, Lord, why did you bring this trouble on these people? Why did you send me here? For I came to Pharaoh, and he's done evil. You didn't deliver your people. He's questioning. He's asking these questions.
Jeff, if you read that further over, when they were in the wilderness and they didn't have water and food, and they said, wow, we should have been back in Egypt where our flesh pots was full. And had they not made it harder, I know this had nothing to do with the class, had Pharaoh not made it harder, they wouldn't want to live. They really probably wouldn't have. I mean, you think about it. That's right. They wouldn't stay. They were in slavery, but they didn't have that bad, really.
Well, not until that new Pharaoh rose up. Think about it. They were striving in Egypt. So there's probably a lot of validity in that they may very well not have wanted to leave. And we know that Pharaoh hardened his heart, but once Pharaoh hardened his heart, what else do you learn? After Pharaoh hardened his heart. See, God has a heart now. God hardened his heart. Like Pharaoh's made his decision. God said, okay, we'll do. And so that's a deep study. But to be fair, we're not going to finish the study anyways tonight. So that was always the goal. It was always the goal when we go into it. But even, Jeremiah questioned as well. And you can go through the list of basically all David questions. But Jeremiah is an interesting one. It says, righteous are you, O Lord, when I plead with you, that you let me talk with you about your judgments. Why does the way of the wicked prosper? Psalm 10, why do you stand afar off, O Lord? Why do you hide in times of trouble? I would be careful with that one. Psalm 44, why do you hide your face and forget our affliction? So are you noticing a theme yet?
They're accusing God of not being who He actually is.
Were they accusing God or were they asking questions?
Well, they were saying, well, are you hiding your face? Well, God never hides His face. He sees everything. So what they're doing is they're really doubting God's ability to do what He says He is, to be everywhere and see everything.
In some cases, that would be correct. If Habakkuk took his approach from a side of doubt, I fully believe, based on what we read in another place, God would have said something. I believe that's where you would have seen, oh, you have little faith or something like that. But he's just asking the question. So a lot of this does come from how you approach it. It really does come from how you approach it. But God did not destroy them for asking the questions. Listen, God's a big God. All right? You're not going to hurt His feelings. Nowhere do I read in the Bible that you're going to hurt His feelings by asking God a question. But sometimes, actually I'd say a lot of the times, when people start asking God questions, they don't like the answer. And that's in part because our brains can't comprehend the things of God. And you think about a lot of little things that we pray. Some of these aren't little things. One of the big ones that always comes up is whenever someone dies, right? You ask God, well, why did they have to die? His ways are higher than ours. We can't answer the question. Why? God sees in the eternal what we can only see in the moment. And so He says, listen, my ways are higher than your ways. My thoughts are higher than your thoughts. And I want you to notice this because it's important. As we're listening to this dialogue unfold, God's not going to answer the question. And so I said that about, a loved one died or something like that. We turn to question and we turn to doubt. Habakkuk's there now. He's at this point now. He's trying to understand, why is this about to happen? And yet God doesn't answer the question. God doesn't answer it for him. Instead, God gives Habakkuk instructions. And his instructions, in essence, are going to answer the question. And really there's a lot of power to understand why. But what he says is our lives are going to be full of times where you're going to question God. That's the gist of it. Your life is going to be full of times when you don't understand why something happens. And we can either torment ourselves, questioning and wondering and doubting, or you can start trusting. His ways are higher. So instead of going one by one through the questions, God gives Habakkuk basically the cheat code here. He says, listen, we're not going to go back and forth on the dialogue, but he wants you to understand something. So he says, I'm going to give you some advice. What you need to do is you need to start trusting. When you get to chapter 2, now you're getting to God's response. But notice God's response. He's not answering the question. God, why would you send Babel? Why would you send someone more wicked to judge a less wicked person? And he doesn't answer. He doesn't say, well, this is why I'm going to use Babylon, and this is the reason behind it. Here's what I'm doing. Verse 1, I've got 2 through 4. I'm going to back up to 1. Verse 1, I will stand my watch and set myself on the rampart and watch to see what he will say to me. That's Habakkuk. I'm going to watch, I'm going to see what he's going to say, and that I will answer when I am corrected. Now that's wisdom right there in and of itself to know I'm about to be corrected. I know that my approach isn't right. I'm about to be corrected. Verse 2, then the Lord answered me and said, write the vision and make it plain on tablets that he who may run, who reads it. that he may run who reads it. For the vision is yet for an appointed time, but at the end it will speak, and it will not lie. Though it tarries, wait for it, because it will surely come. It will not tarry. So that right there is just a way of God saying, hey, listen, what I've said, it's going to happen. You're questioning it. You're worried about the wrong thing. You're asking all the questions. There's nothing wrong with the question. You're worrying about the wrong thing. What God has said is going to happen is going to happen. Verse 4, behold the proud. His soul's not right upright in him. And then he says this, but. There it is. There's the contracting point. But the just shall live by faith. You want answers to every question in the world with this notion that our minds could comprehend everything of God. Do you honestly believe our minds could comprehend everything God knows? No. People have asked me this before, and it's a loaded question because I can't answer it. But people asked me this before, well, when Paul saw into the third heaven, why do you think God wouldn't let him reveal it? I'm like, well, one, I don't know. But also, I would say he couldn't reveal it because I don't think there's words to describe it that we can understand. Verse 4 is quoted, and we talked about verse 4 this past week. This verse is quoted 3 times in the New Testament. Romans 1, Galatians 3, Hebrews 10. And it's always around salvation to some level. Trusting in God, walking in faith. And it sounds great when you think about it in terms of salvation. The problem that comes into play is, he says, the just shall live by faith. Well, what about it? What about when it's not easy? Because he answers Habakkuk by not answering Habakkuk. He doesn't go very question by question. Well, here's your question, I'm going to give you, here's your question, here's your question. He says, no, listen. What I'm doing is going to be done. The proud, they're going to have their answers. But the just, they're the ones that live by faith. So when he says the just live by faith, why do you think he would say that? The just will live by faith. Well, I should have put it on the very top because it kind of gives it away. But when he says the just shall live by faith in response to Habakkuk, what's he really saying? You got to trust him. You've got to trust because you see this. It's dark. Can anybody see anything outside right now other than a couple lights flashing? Now what if God is sitting here saying, hey, listen, I see outside. You don't see it. You can't see what's out there. But I'm saying it's fine. You can go outside. There's nothing wrong. You got to trust that I know what I'm saying. And so he says, here's what you need to know. You want all the answers to all these questions, but here's what you need to know. The just, they live by faith. Habakkuk, you have to trust me. You have to have faith in me. You don't see it yet, but you will. You know what this reminds me of? My kids play in the street. Neighborhood we used to live in, our kids would play in the street, and I remember this conversation I had with Mason. And I was yelling at him, hey, get out of the street. Don't play in the street. And do you know what he said to me? He said, Dad, you don't ever let me have any fun. That's one of the first times he called me Dad. And I remember he said this, why do you hate me so much? And I don't remember what the kid's name was. I said Timmy, I don't remember what the kid's name was. He's like, well, he gets to play in the street. And my smart aleck response said, well, his dad doesn't love him. That was a smart aleck response, but that's just... And so I was like, well, I do love you. That's why I don't want you playing in the street. But do you think that answer made sense to him? Because to him, that's what he saw as fun. And here's every parent's go-to statement. Trust me, this is for your own good. Do you think that answer ever suffices? I never got that answer once where I was like, well, thank you. That's the answer I was hoping for. I'm going to trust you. That's God's answer. He's like, listen, there's going to be things like you're not going to understand. There will be questions that seemingly go unanswered, prayers that seemingly go unanswered, and that questioning phase is going into full speed. And he said, and that's fine so long as it's blanketed with faith, because even though you don't understand, the just, they live by faith. Because they're trusting in someone bigger than every situation. So that when those hard times come up, and when those questions seem to be unanswered, we know that God is at work in all this. There's something out there. And our call is to simply trust Him. But then comes the next level of faith. And there's a distinct comparison that we're going to look at in like a blistering pace now. But there's a distinct comparison made in the Bible between trusting in God and something else. So I'm not going to get you turned. We were going to actually read and spend some time on this. We're not going to now. Psalm 5 verse 11. Write that down. Psalm 5 verse 11 says, I'll at least read it, but let all those who rejoice, who put their trust in you, let them ever shout for joy because you defend them. Let those also who love your name be joyful in you. So the correlation is made there between trusting and praising. The Bible makes that correlation for us. The final section then is just that, as you come to chapter 3, that we're not really going to get to look at. Chapter 3, Habakkuk had the questions. He got an answer he didn't really want, so he questions more. Then he got an answer that questions the whole direction of his life. Chapter 3, he realizes, and chapter 3 is nothing but prayer. Chapter 3 is his entire prayer. Verse 2, O Lord, I've heard your speech and was afraid. O Lord, revive your work in the midst of the years. In the midst of the years, make it known. And I love the next line. In wrath, remember mercy. That's a great line. God came from Teman, the Holy One, from Mount Paran, Selah. His glory covered the heavens, and the earth was full of His praise. This whole chapter is a prayer, and it's a prayer to song. It's like a sung devotional that he's doing here. He says, God, you've always been faithful in the past. And he goes back to examples of God's faithfulness. And he says, I'm going to trust you. I'm going to praise God for the future He brings because I trust the past of what He's done. And so to close, we'll just jump all the way down now to verse 17. I want you to hear the difference. All right? Remember where we've come from. Right? Habakkuk was just questioning. And now verse 17. Though the fig tree may not blossom, nor fruit be on the vines, though the labor of the olive may fail, and the fields yield no food, though the flock may be cut off from the fold, and there be no herd in the stall. So, again, scorched earth, Babylon, everything's going to be destroyed, right? And he's saying that, there's going to be starvation. There could be starvation, death. Everything could be taken away. What remains then when they do that is going to be utterly destroyed. Regardless of that, you get to verse 18, yet I will rejoice. I will joy in the God of my salvation. Do you hear the change in the prophet? You hear how he's gone now? Oh God, why does evil keep happening to now? God, I'm going to praise you in the midst of all of it. Now whatever happens, I'm going to live by faith. I'm going to praise you regardless. Whatever happens, you are God. I'm going to put my faith in you. And then verse 19 to close the book out is a fascinating one that you can kind of gloss right over if you're not careful. Verse 19, the Lord God is my strength. He will make my feet like deer's feet, and He will make me walk on high hills. So when he describes, I know we've had some that actually went to Israel. When y'all went into the mountain, did y'all see the goats y'all may have seen videos of these goats that are walking around these little steep cliffs around the edges of mountains? You ever notice you ever just stop and watch and just say, hey, one of these goats is going to fall? You know what they don't ever do? They don't ever fall. They are the most sure-footed creatures you're going to find. They can run, they can jump, they're graceful, they don't fall. But the power of what the prophet just said is this. God's going to make my feet like those deer's feet. And I was questioning, I wasn't sure, you've given me my instructions. Now through my faith, He's going to make my feet so sure that I'm not going to fall either. I'm not going to stumble, I'm not going to trip up. You want to know how? The just live by faith. They put their trust in Him. So you see the three levels of faith here. The questioning level, I'll put it back. The questioning level, the trusting level, and the praising level. Wouldn't it be nice if you could just go from 0 to praise and miss all the in-between? But the questioning phase is what keeps coming up over and over again. Well, why does this happen? And you get Habakkuk's answer in that. He said, I see who you are now. Regardless of what happens, I'm going to praise you, and I'm not going to worry about it. All right, any questions on Habakkuk? I know we kind of crash-landed chapter 3. I'll blame Dupree for speaking up tonight.
That's a good lesson.